Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. There's more to reporting than CDR. Bergeson Campbell and our affiliated consulting firm, the Actor Group, are just really pleased that you are with us today. Thank you for joining. I'm Lynn Bergeson, and I'm going to serve as your moderator for today's webinar. Now, we scheduled this webinar in light of the many questions that we are fielding from our clients based on the volume of these questions and the intricacy, for lack of a better word, given all of the many reporting obligations that are now in play and will be in play. We also thought it was just a terrific way of inviting our colleagues at EPA to share their views on some of these important reporting obligations and to emphasize why these reporting obligations exist and how dependent we all are on quality data and information to support EPA's rulemaking and other initiatives. In that regard, we are thrilled, really pleased to have today two of OPPT's finest. Stephanie Griffin is acting supervisor of the data collection branch in OPPT, and Dave Turk is supervisor for the TRI regulatory and policy branch. Dave and Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. Following their remarks, none other than our own Dr. Richard Engler, Director of Chemistry here at Bergeson Campbell and the ACTA Group, will share some reminders and tips, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. We have already received a number of really excellent questions from some of our registrants, and so we'll go through those first. But if you have additional questions, we ask that you enter them into the Q&A portal on your Zoom dashboard. Just a quick reminder, you should have the slides already. We sent those out a bit ago, but they are also available in the resource portion of your Zoom dashboard, along with more extensive biographical statements of our presenters, and a very important and we think very helpful resource document that we've pulled together for your review and consideration. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who will begin and go through his slides, and then it will be followed up by Rich, who will go through his, and then Stephanie, Dave, and Rich will entertain Q&A. So thanks, everybody, and Dave, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. Hi, I'd like to thank Bergeson Campbell for hosting this webinar and for inviting Stephanie Griffin and me to participate. As Lynn mentioned, Stephanie will largely be contributing to the Q&A portion of today's event. Today I'll be covering some provisions in TSCA Section 8, largely going up the alphabet from paragraph A through E of Section 8. For today's presentation, I'll be first giving a quick overview of Section 8 to give a feel for the various provisions, and then I'll launch into a more detailed overview of the provisions in turn. One thing that I'll notice at the theme here is that regulated entities are providing information that they have, know of, or generally should be able to provide, as opposed to actually creating data, which is more, as an example, the domain of Section 4 of TSCA, among other authorities. Next slide, please. Section 8 is divided amongst various paragraphs, each focused on a different slice of information. There's also some overlap among the provisions. I'll warn you that this slide deck has a fair number of slides, and the details are largely going to be front-loaded here. So during this presentation, I'll first start with paragraph A and the most, and then the number of words that I say will diminish as we go through the other letters of the alphabet. So starting with paragraph A, that enables EPA to promulgate reporting and record keeping related to the manufacture, process, use, and disposal of a chemical. Generally, picture things like the identity of a chemical, categories of use, amount processed or manufactured, resulting byproducts, worker exposure, and similar sorts of information. Chemical data reporting, CDR, which was formerly called the Inventory Update Rule, IUR, is EPA's ongoing general example of an 8A rule, though it's not the only 8A rule. I'm not really going to get into section or paragraph B, which pertains to setting up and maintaining the TSCA inventory. Just wanted to mention it since I'm going to then jump over to paragraph C, which is focused on ensuring that manufacturers, processors, and distributors maintain records related to adverse reactions related to chemicals. Paragraph D empowers EPA to require manufacturers, processors, and distributors to provide information regarding health and safety studies to EPA. We generally refer to this as unpublished health and safety data. And then paragraph E is a bit unique compared to the other paragraphs in that it requires manufacturers, processors, and distributors to notify EPA of information that reasonably supports the conclusion that there's a substantial risk to health or the environment, as opposed to being tied to a specific data call that EPA promulgates. Next slide. So the theme here, as I mentioned before, is that entities likely have information or access to information that is information that EPA generally doesn't have. And then EPA can in turn require entities to provide such information to the agency. So we're generally talking about rules that are aimed at, again, getting information as opposed to regulations that control or restrict. And as a general theme, when agencies, or at least EPA, has the ability to collect information as opposed to actually control, there's oftentimes somewhat wide latitude in terms of the ability that the agency has in terms of how it performs these rulemakings. And so to that end, EPA makes use of these Section 8 authorities to just make sure that the agency has information that it needs to conduct its other activities, such as controlling or restricting the use of a chemical. It's also information that the public's generally interested in, especially if there's health or safety or environmental effects information. Then there's a slew of users, as well as users at the state and local and even sometimes other governments. So a wide set of uses. And so generally we're trying to figure out where there's data gaps that need to be addressed, and then using these authorities to then try to provide more information to fill in those gaps. The general theme, again, as I mentioned before, is that it's information that's known to or reasonably ascertainable, generally in possession of a company, again, as opposed to actually developing information. Okay, so then the next slide, we'll dig in a little bit deeper into Section 8A. I listed on this slide the statutorily provided categories of information that the agency can require reporting on. I mentioned them earlier, so I'm not going to read them out loud again, but they're listed in this slide. Again, the theme is information about the amount of the chemical exposure related identity and things like that. Moving on to the next slide, one thing that I will mention is that TSCA generally exempts small manufacturers and processors from Section 8A rules. Though small entities may be required to report if they're subject to certain TSCA actions. What constitutes a small manufacturer or processor gets defined via rulemaking, and in doing so, EPA must consult with the Small Business Administration for such definitions. The general theme for most of our current Section 8A rules is that a small manufacturer or processor, where processors are required to report, tends to be a company with less than $120 million in sales, provided no individual site manufactures more than 100,000 pounds, or sales that are generally less than $12 million, regardless of the production volume. Also, another theme with Section A reporting is that the rules, to the extent feasible, must minimize unnecessary or duplicative reporting, should minimize costs in small entities, and the reporting obligation should be tied to entities that likely would report. I'll also mention that Congress, with the Lautenberg amendments, did amend paragraph A to add a sub-number 7, which required EPA to conduct a PFAS-specific reporting requirement, which we'll go over in a few slides. And the other thing I'll just mention again is the one standard ongoing 8A reporting requirement that EPA is currently maintaining is the chemical data reporting, CDR. And among other uses, CDR just provides an overall view of chemical manufacturing, including importation that's occurring in the US. Next slide, please. For the Section 8A rules, EPA employs a known to or reasonably ascertainable by the submitter reporting standard. This is defined to include all information in a person's possession or control, and all information that a reasonable person similarly situated might be expected to possess, control, or know. For Section 8A, and the theme again for all of Section 8, is that there's no testing or monitoring requirement, though depending on the organization's size or structure, there may be some level of surveying amongst the company that would be expected or anticipated for someone that's in a reasonably situated situation, similarly situated situation. Sorry, I was getting caught on my words. I'll say that EPA does receive questions related to this standard, and we've provided various guidance materials online. Following slides will provide links to such information. We maintain multiple email addresses that you can use, as well as a phone call away in terms of getting help that you may need. And I think also the general theme is one of common sense and reasonableness, with the caution that this standard isn't one that allows you to just apply blinders to information that may be accessible to you. Next slide, please. So we generally encourage, in terms of getting prepared for reporting, that you try to understand the requirements. We have a slew of guidance that we provide online. The guidance we have high-level guidance, we have more nuanced guidance. I recommend you take a look at the 101 type info, figure out to what extent a given reporting requirement may apply to you, and then to start digging a little bit further into the more topic-specific guidance as you go. Again, you can reach out for support. We also post webinars online. We have Q&As. Some of these Q&As are sort of rolling, and as we get new questions, we'll expand the Q&As to make sure that we're continuing to address the common types of questions we receive. Another thing we generally recommend everyone do is that as soon as you're aware that you likely have a Section 8 reporting requirement, that you do go ahead and register in the Central Data Exchange, or CDX. That's EPA's web portal, essentially, to the various reporting applications that are used to respond to many of EPA's reporting requirements. Essentially, all of the TSCA reporting requirements use the same applications in CDX. So we recommend that you register and just familiarize yourself with that system. And I'll say that I've been in EPA for a while now, and I'll say that myself and my colleagues, we all take your questions very seriously. We endeavor to answer everything we receive. We try to be timely. Generally, we're amenable to feedback that you may have regarding our guidance. We want our guidance to be up to date. We regularly try to refresh it. So please do reach out to us and give us feedback, and don't be shy about asking your questions if you have something that you're not quite sure the answer to. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so we've made it beyond the general boilerplate of the statute, and we're getting to an actual reporting requirement. So this is, again, the chemical data reporting CDR that I mentioned previously. We're actually currently in the throes of CDR reporting. It's an every 4-year reporting requirement. The last reporting cycle prior to this one was in 2020, and it covered 2016 to 2019 data. Now that we're in 2024, the period's 2020 to 2023. Reporting started June 1st, and it goes through September 30th. So that's when the deadline is. CDR is generally, as I think mentioned earlier, it's a useful overview of chemical manufacturing importation in the U.S. We typically receive reports on, I think it's about 8,000 to 9,000 chemicals. So this in turn and helps the EPA screen chemicals, get an idea of possible exposure concerns, especially for workers. They're specifically reporting elements on workers likely to be exposed to the chemical being reported on. It also helps us measure successive programs that have been designed to phase out chemicals and informs decision-making. It even can be useful to companies to get a better feel for how other, in their industry are making use of chemicals and to what extent. So there's a slew of uses, and we do try to make the information we receive pursuant to CDR available to the public as soon as possible. It ranges how long it takes us, but usually within about a year, we can publish some version of the data set that we received. Next slide, please. Okay, so the threshold for CDR generally for most chemicals is 25,000 pounds. So the threshold is lower at 2,500 pounds for chemicals that are subject to various TSCA actions, such as a test order, a significant new use rule, or risk management rules. We provide an Excel that we post online on our CDR webpage, as well as through the Substance Registry Service. If you're familiar with SRS, it's an EPA tool to look up information related to chemicals in terms of EPA regulations on those chemicals. But we provide this Excel and these resources to help you figure out which threshold applies to a given chemical. Again, you can also reach out and ask if you're not sure about the threshold for a given chemical. But do please be sure to report by September 30th if you do need to report. The next slide, please. Okay, so this slide and the next slides, I'm not going to really speak too much. I just wanted to include them so you have a copy of them. These slides are available online as well in our instructions. We also have a 101 sort of overview presentation, which is where I grabbed these slides from. And these are just to help you understand some of the nuances of CDR reporting. So as an example, this slide tries to make the point that when you're considering the threshold, you're looking at any one of the years in the reporting period. And if you hit the threshold for any one of those years, then you have a reporting requirement for CDR. So it's not just the most recent year. It's not that you have to trigger it for all years. Any one of the years, if you hit the threshold for a chemical, then a report would be required for that chemical. Next slide, please. Okay, and then for this slide, getting into some of the information of what types of data are reported. So the one thing I'll point out on this slide is that while CDR does cover multiple reporting years, we have a principal year, which is the most recent reporting year. So for 2024, we're talking about reporting occurring now. We're talking about 2023 as the principal year. And that's where most of the data information is being reported on. But then we do also have a reporting requirement for production volume for the other reporting years. And then for the next slide, which is the last kind of example of the details of CDR slide, this one gets into the concept of one of the requirements is that sites that are reporting have to report on the types of activities and uses that are occurring. And this is broken into categories such as industrial processing and use, as well as commercial and or consumer use reporting. I will say that generally as a theme, EPA often makes some tweaks to how CDR reporting occurs every 4 years. And the good news for everyone, I think, is that for 2024, the reporting requirements are essentially identical to as what they were for 2020, outside of which years you're reporting on, as well as the one change, and we had already broadcasted this change was happening back when we made the update for the 2020 cycle. But for 2024, we have some additional activity codes that you can select and use to describe how the chemical is being actually used by either the site reporting or downstream entities. So these updated codes are available in the instruction, but that's the only substantive change between 2024 and 2020 in terms of the data elements. Next slide, please. So for this slide, this is just a bunch of resources to support CDR reporting. The website listed at the top is a particular node. If you go to the CDR website, you can essentially get to any of the materials from there. And I do want to flag something that we're excited about, and that is that we have something called CDR Guide Me. It's a new set of web pages. If you're familiar with the toxicity release inventory reporting at all, we've had something called Guide Me working for that for a while. And essentially, the Guide Me structure is our way to try to put together all of our guidance for a given topic in an easy to use and find structure. What's also great is that for most of the documents, you can view it as a URL page or you can grab it as a PDF. And if it's a URL page, we can actually send, if someone asks us a question, we can send you a URL to the specific portion of the guidance that addresses your question. So we think it's really useful, and we're definitely looking for feedback here on how to improve it. For this current CDR cycle, we're going to maintain 2 versions of our guidance. We'll have the guidance that we've been posting on the CDR website as always, and then we'll have the same version that's in CDR Guide Me. I think what the idea here is that we'll start to transition so that the 2028 CDR reporting will leverage more Guide Me and less the website when it comes to the guidance, but more to come, and we'll see what sort of feedbacks or reactions that we get from stakeholders like yourself. So do please let us know what you think of that site. If you have any suggestions, we're definitely amenable to that. And then moving on to the next slide, this is just some of the links again. This is some direct links to some resources that you might be interested in. So I'll flag, especially the first row is for the main instructions guidance for CDR. It's where you'll probably get like 99% of your questions answered. But then there are some other sources below as well that I just want to make sure you have direct access to. So that's the purpose of this slide. Okay, then moving on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the PFAS data reporting rule that I mentioned that was a requirement that Congress placed on EPA back in 2016, requiring EPA to promulgate a rule to require manufacturers of PFAS to report on manufacturing or importing of these substances going back to 2011. So this is a rulemaking that we did propose and then ultimately finalize. The reporting period is set to begin in November, and the reports are generally due by May 8th of 2025. We are providing some extra time for certain small manufacturers. A small manufacturer for this rule is, sorry, let me restart that. This extended period is for a small manufacturer that is reporting exclusively as an article importer. And for those entities, they'll have until November 10th of 2025. This is the same small threshold that I mentioned before, where it's annual sales of less than 120 million, provided the site manufactures less than 100,000 pounds or less than $12 million in sales, regardless of the manufactured quantity. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read this definition out loud to you, but this is the definition of PFAS that's being used for this rulemaking. It's generally a definition that EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, so PPT, has been using for some of its other activities, such as the recent significant new use rule on inactive PFAS that have been in commerce. Given that this is a definition rather than a discrete bounded list, EPA has been providing various resources to help people determine whether or not the chemical that you're dealing with is considered a PFAS for purposes of this reporting requirement. To that end, we've provided an Excel. If you're familiar with the Comtox dashboard, which is just essentially a dashboard of many different chemicals, we've created a list in that dashboard to help identify PFAS that we've located and can point to that do fit this definition. So they're not necessarily the end all be all to describe all chemicals and whether or not they fit the definition, but it should be vast majority of the chemicals that we might expect reporting on are covered by the Excel and or the Comtox dashboard. I'll say too that TSCA, as a general rule of thumb, does exclude certain chemical substances from being covered by TSCA. This is focused on uses, so activities involving food or food additives, certain pesticides, and other chemicals can be excluded from TSCA reporting as related to those uses. And so it's a little nuanced, I'll just warn, in that a chemical may have several uses. For example, one of the uses may be as a food additive, but then it may also have another use that is a TSCA covered use. And so it may be that a chemical has reporting required for some uses and not others. We try to provide some guidance to help delineate some of this. For some of these chemicals and uses, it may get a little fact specific or wonky. So if you're not sure, again, you can just reach out to us and we'll try to help you figure that out. For the next slide, this is just an overview of the types of information that are being reported. These are the same sorts of information that I had mentioned previously when talking about 8A generally. So you're looking at things like the identity of the chemical, categories of use, the quantity that's manufactured, some information on byproducts. There's a requirement to provide information that you may have on environmental health effects, worker exposure information, and some reporting related to disposal as well. I see the actual guidance of the form for more nuanced view of this information, but I think this gives you a good overview of the types of information that we'll be receiving. And again, this is information that will be reported for each of the years 2011 through 2022. So it's a little different than CDR, where for CDR, the bulk of the reporting elements are only for the most recent year, whereas for this one-time PFAS data reporting rule, all the elements are covered for each of the reporting years. But I will say, if you move on to the next slide, that we do have streamlined, okay, perfect. We do have some streamlined reporting forms for article importers and manufacturers of certain research and development chemicals that are simpler forms that have fewer data elements. They focus generally on chemical identity, use information volumes, as well as there's optional ability to then provide more information as well. But those are the main data elements that are covered for article importers and R&D substances produced in limited quantities. Okay, moving on to the next slide. These are some tips for reporting. They're pretty similar to what I said earlier. Given how expansive the rule is and that it goes back to 2011 information, we recommend getting started sooner rather than later to figure out, what information is reasonably ascertainably known to you, if you do have a reporting requirement. On the next slide, I'm providing some links of note are the reporting instructions. That's a great place, as with CDR, to get started if you're trying to understand the scope of the 887 reporting. We also have a compliance guidance for small entities. There's Q&As, and then there's the TSCA hotline. And as I mentioned before, we do view the Q&A document as a living document. So if you have any questions that we don't have answered there, and we think they're ones that many other people may also have, we do view the Q&A document, something that can expand. So definitely do let us know if you have questions or think something could be clarified, and we'll try to improve the guidance to help accommodate such questions. Okay, so then moving on to the next slide. So we've left section 8A, and now we're going to very quickly go through C, D, and E. As I mentioned earlier, section 8C empowers EPA to require record keeping and or submittal of records related to significant adverse reactions to health or the environment. Significant adverse reactions defined as reactions that may indicate a substantial impairment of normal activities or long-lasting or irreversible damage to health or the environment. Generally speaking, there's a 30-year record-keeping period for worker health reports, 5 years for most other records. Sources of records can come from consumers, workers, essentially any source. There are allegations of impact of significant adverse reactions. Generally speaking, there's a record-keeping requirement, so these records must be maintained by the company's facilities on site. As EPA, if we conduct a site inspection, we can ask to see such records, and then EPA can also do a records call-in, as we call it, where we can request that such records be submitted to the agency. I'll add that EPA has codified its 8C authority to not include retailers, sole distributors, as well as certain types of manufacturers have been excluded as well through regulation. For example, where manufacturing solely involves mining or other solely extractive functions. And then there's also very kind of nuanced types of manufacturing that result from certain types of chemical reactions that have also been generally exempted from 8C reporting. Next slide, please. I'll also mention that EPA has recently done a records call-in on a chemical that's shorthand name is MBOCA. We're assessing whether or not to request records for other chemicals. This provision has not been one that agencies used all that often in terms of actual call-ins. The records maintenance has been an ongoing requirement for quite some time, and site inspectors do somewhat regularly ask to see such records, but the actual act of EPA requesting records to be called in has only happened, I think, 4 times now, if I remember correctly, with the 4th being this recent call-in on MBOCA. So it's something that we haven't made extensive use of, but it is something we're considering whether or not to continue pursuing. So more to come there. For the next slide, getting into section 8D. This, as I mentioned before, enables EPA to require manufacturers, processors, and or distributors to provide lists and or copies of health and safety studies. Health and safety study refers to studies on any effect of a chemical substance or mixture with regard to the human health or the environment. I'll say generally that there's 2 ways that the agency tends to do 8D rules. One is a follow-on action to a report that gets published by the Interagency Testing Committee, the ITC. TSCA Section 4 establishes this Interagency Testing Committee, and essentially that committee is made up of several, or more than several really, federal agencies that are supposed to communicate their information needs on various chemicals to then have EPA in turn require testing on those chemicals to generate more information. And EPA has a set up a framework where if the ITC recommends certain chemicals for testing, then we will, as a general theme, do an 8D reporting requirement on those chemicals, because we'd rather, if the information already exists and someone has it and they just haven't published it, and we can get that information in lieu of having to then issue a testing requirement on the chemical. That's a win for everyone. So that's one of the ways that we make use of 8D. The other way we make use of 8D is if we just have unique interests in a chemical unrelated to the ITC, we can go through the usual rulemaking process where we propose to require AT reporting on certain chemicals, and then based on public feedback, we take final action, whether withdraw, modify, or finalize the requirement as it had been proposed. So moving on to the next slide, I can say that we currently have. Thank you. We currently have a reporting requirement on 16 chemicals. The comment period for this proposal closed on May 28th. Yeah, May 28th. And we're currently considering next steps. So thank you for everyone who commented on the proposal. I'll just say quickly that prior to this proposal, we did make use of the 8D authority in 2021 on 50 chemicals. And then prior to the 2021 rule, I think the last use of 8D was in 2008, I think. We used to historically make more use of it, and then kind of fell to the wayside for a little bit. And it's another authority that we've been eyeing a little more closely, given our ongoing need to prioritize chemicals for risk evaluation, conduct risk evaluation on chemicals, and then handle risk management rules as applicable. So 8D is generally a productive means for the agency to help understand the baseline information that various companies may have regarding chemical substances for which EPA has these ongoing, statutory obligations to review. Okay, and then the next slide, please. Okay, very quick time warp back to Section 8. TDR, tiered data reporting, is a rule that the agency is considering to try to help us address a problem that we generally have with regard to conducting risk evaluations on chemicals. As I just mentioned, TSCA requires EPA to identify substances that are called high priority substances, and those are high priority substances for risk evaluation. So we just need to have more information and better understanding of chemicals to help us identify which chemicals we should be prioritizing in what order, and then ensure that we have the information then help us conduct the risk evaluations. And so to that end, we've been considering this rule called TDR that would be sort of an enhanced CDR that would be on specific chemicals of interest. And so more to come there. If you go to the next slide, I will just end the discussion on TDR by mentioning that the idea here is that we'd have a standardized framework to get more detailed information. Rather than doing one-off rules to try to get certain information on certain chemicals, we'd have an overarching framework that the regulated community would be aware of and understand that when a chemical gets added to TDR, this is the extra type of information beyond CDR that we're looking for to help inform our ability to then, again, prioritize or do risk evaluation on a chemical. I will say that a few years ago, we did have a webinar to share some of ideas related to TDR at the time and to get input. I believe we still have our web pages up related to that webinar and some of the information that we received. So you're welcome to go there to get an idea of what we were thinking a few years ago. And I will say also that TDR, we're trying to marry together sections 8A, 8C, and 8D to have one framework, again, for collecting information. So that way, as soon as we start the process and we say, chemical X is one that we're adding to TDR, then everyone will know, okay, for chemical X, this is the sort of information that's going to be needed, these X years to come, and just kind of make it easier for the agency to conduct these activities rather than, again, doing a separate 8D rule or separate 8C call-in or separate 8A. And then also, because it's a framework, we'll go through notice and comment on it and get the public's input in terms of how to structure it. So more to come. Wish there was more I can say about it, but we've been working on it for a while, and we're getting close to a point where I think we're able to share more details, but it's not quite there yet. But I did want to just mention it, that keep an eye out for it. Okay, and then for the last slide of substance, I am closing with Section 8E, and this is the provision that I mentioned earlier that requires manufacturers, processors, and distributors of a chemical substance or mixture to notify EPA immediately as soon as they become aware of information that reasonably supports the conclusion that the given substance or mixture presents a substantial risk of injury to health or the environment, unless the person knows that EPA is already aware of this information. The agency regularly receives these 8E notices, and then in turn, we generally make them available in an application called ChemView, which is EPA's kind of primary means of making TSCA information available to the public. So just be aware of AD. If you ever have questions about whether or not information, would require an AD submission, again, you can reach out to us. A lot of companies just generally just send us the information rather than investigate, just as kind of a safety net. But do as you think is proper, as you're advised. Just make sure that you're not failing to provide information that you do have that may hit the standard. So I realize it's not necessarily a bright line. So we do understand that there may be questions that arise regarding specific sets of information that develop. So again, you can reach out to us if you have questions. And that does it. Again, I'd like to thank the opportunity to present and look forward to your questions that come later. I'll turn it over to Rich now.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that excellent overview. So I want to remind folks of a number of things and provide some tips as you're considering what and how and when to report for your various Section 8 obligations. Next slide. So let me start by reminding everyone, I mean, this is a critical, Dave mentioned this, but I really want to remind folks, EPA is required to use reasonably available information. TSCA requires EPA to do this in its risk assessment, Section 5 and Section 6. And that includes data that's available through Section 8 data gathering, 8A, 8C, 8D. So EPA has to do this, and therefore EPA has to issue the Section 8 rules to make sure that they're meeting their obligations. It is critical as the regulated community that we recognize EPA has this obligation, and it's on us to help them to understand the burden, gather the information, gather it timely. Of course, more comprehensive data leads to a better scientific decision. So data are preferable to models. And so if we have data, if the regulated community has data, we need to make sure that EPA has access to that data so that they can use the data rather than relying on its conservative models. And that's the data owner's obligation to provide that data timely. And of course, it's EPA's obligation to use that data appropriately, fit for purpose. Next slide. I do want to remind folks the nano reporting, that TSCA Section 8A nano reporting rule is still in effect. I mean, I certainly my brain thinks of, oh, that was 2018, that was a long time ago, but the rule is still in effect, and I do have to remind myself when I'm dealing with a client with a nanomaterial and manufacturer importing, make sure to remind them of this obligation. If the nano form has not been reported previously, you are required to report 135 days in advance of that initial manufacturer import, or 30 days, or within 30 days of formation of intent, if you can't notify 135 days in advance. You do not have to wait for EPA's review. It's not like a PMN. You just tell EPA, here's the nano form, here's what I know about it, and then you can go about your business. But I just wanted to put that in here, a tickler, like this is still in effect. Not sure what EPA is doing with the nano data. They're busy with lots and lots of other things. So I think the nano data is sort of waiting for EPA to have capacity to get back to that. But the obligation is there nevertheless. Next slide. When you're doing your reporting and record keeping, you need to ensure consistent reporting across reporting data flows, CDR, TRI, 8A7, whatever it may be. You need to be working with a consistent set of data and viewing it with a consistent lens. EPA definitely reviews CDR reporting from cycle to cycle. So this year with 2024, after reporting's done, EPA is going to compare 2024 reporting with 2020 reporting, and EPA, at least they have in the past, has reached out to reporters if there were significant changes in the reporting from cycle to cycle. So you should don't be surprised if EPA contacts you. You're not required to respond to EPA. EPA is mostly doing data quality checks. There may be some implications, some enforcement implications if you go and correct CDR. So you definitely want to seek counsel on that. But be prepared. If you have big changes in reporting, be prepared for EPA to contact you and make sure that you know that you're confident in advance that you understand why your reporting is different from in 2024 than 2020. Accuracy matters. EPA enforcement officials treat over-reporting as seriously as under-reporting. So don't just say, well, I'm not really sure how much it was, so I'm going to like report extra. EPA gets grumpy about that. So, right, you need a basis for your number. That calculation, you need to be consistent about that. You need to have a reason to report the number that you report, and EPA expects you to report to two significant figures. Whatever calculations, assumptions, or exemptions, whatever you're doing for a particular reporting cycle, keep notes on that. If you're availing yourself of an exemption, make a note, like I'm not reporting this substance for this reason in this cycle. It not only is important if you are audited or inspected by EPA, but it's also important communicating to your future self. So whatever assumptions you make in 2024, you will have that record for 2028 to be able to look back and say, oh yeah, we didn't report this chemical because of this exemption, or we use this assumption about the percentage in a formulation in 2024. We're going to use that again in 2028, unless you have some reason to change it. So write these things down, make a record. You don't have to send them to EPA, but you should have a record that you can find in 4 years' time, or someone else at your company can find in 4 years' time, so that you understand why you reported the numbers that you reported. And it not only is it important for your record keeping, responding to EPA, but it's important to ensure consistent reporting in different CDR cycles. Dave mentioned the not known or reasonably ascertainable threshold that has been consistent across the data reporting flows. So it's not. We're very pleased that EPA is not reinventing this wheel for each of these. Definitions are consistent, but it does require due diligence, and Dave talked about that. And most rules do limit reporting to the manufacturer or importer. HC is a notable exemption to that. But if you're doing mixing, we get this question a lot. If you're doing mixing in the United States without reaction, you are a processor. You're not manufacturing a substance. It's the reporting obligation is on the manufacturer or importer of the substance, not a processor that's making a mixture. Next slide. Many of the 8A rules exempt reports that would be duplicative. EPA is required to limit duplicative reporting, but you have to have documentation that the reporting is duplicative. So you have to be able to point to it. It may be easier to report twice. If you're doing that, of course, ensure consistent reporting. But if you've got good record keeping for why you reported to one data flow, then you can apply that again for the next. But also you need to be aware the EPA is removing reporting exemptions. Certainly the 8A7, which has essentially no reporting exemptions, is very different than CDR. So you may see, as you're preparing your 8A7 reports, if you reported CDR for some PFAS, you may find that your 8A7 reports are substantially different, because there may be things that were exempt from the CDR reporting that are not exempt under 8A7. So the quantities may be different. So be aware of that, especially if you are reporting CDR and the same PFAS for CDR and 8A7. Of course, there are going to be a lot of reports under 8A7 that were not reportable under CDR because of that lack of exemptions. So the consistency there is no consistency to maintain there. You've got an entirely different fact set to report. Dave mentioned the proposed Section 8D rule. You may have noticed, we certainly commented on it on behalf of a number of our clients and groups. EPA has removed the exemption for content and articles, and there's essentially no de minimis threshold. So this is going to be a real challenge. Not sure what the final rule is going to look like. EPA won't be able to talk about how its views on the final 8D rule. But if the rule is published in final as proposed, then you're going to have to go back and look at all your reports to see if there's any information in those reports that relate to any of the 16 substances that are in the 8D rule. It's going to be a real burden on reporters to go back and sift through that data. It's not that you would necessarily have to report them, but you have to go back and look. That's part of the due diligence, is going to look to see what data is there. You also may find that past activities, as EPA diminishes these exemptions, past activities that might have been exempt will become reportable. Next slide. Dave mentioned CDX. Please make sure that you have multiple primary authorized officials. I emphasize plural. You really need more than one AO. Primary authorized official is not your role within the company. It doesn't mean, VP of EH&S. It doesn't mean, a general counsel or COO. It doesn't have to be some senior official. It needs to be an individual that works for the company that's authorized by the company to submit to CDX. It might be someone very senior, but it could also be the person that's entering the data. You can have the data entry person be an AO. And you can come up with your own procedures internally to determine who's going to push the button, who's going to review the data. That's all a company decision. What EPA wants in CDX is they need someone who is authorized by the company to submit data, and you need to have more than one. You need to make sure that all AOs are using the same organization ID. Do not make the mistake that BNC and ACTA have in the past. We have 4 different organizations that represent BNC and 4 different organizations that represent ACTA, because different people at different times used slightly different addresses. There is no way to remove, once an organization is created, an org ID is created, there's no way to remove it. All you can do is deactivate it for your account. So you get that first AO in, have that person share their organization ID number, the actual number, with all the other authorized officials. And then also, as you develop submissions, you're going to generate passphrases. Make sure that AOs have access to the passphrases. Find a secure location within the company to store them. Don't rely on one person's memory, because you have the shared data that you all need to access. Both the multiple AOs and AOs now and AOs in the future, you need to have access to the organization ID and the passphrases. Dave already mentioned, don't wait to the last minute. You can do your CDX registration now. Most people can get identity proofed immediately, but if a paper letter is required, it can take weeks. And you'll see in the reporting obligations, each reporting obligation has its own data flow, but they're very similar. So as you're doing CDR and 8A7, you'll get more familiar with how the reporting appears and what the fields are. So the user experience will be similar. And one last point, and then we can go to Q&A, is CBI claims. You have to make sure that your CBI claims are made at the time of submission, that you've checked the boxes that you need to check, and you need to make sure the substantiation is there. And please, 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 if you are reporting accession numbers, take great care with CBI identities. EPA's view, as promulgated in the final CBI rule, is if any submitter provides an accession number and does not claim that accession number as CBI, then EPA takes that submission as an affirmative disclosure of the chemical identity, the specific chemical identity that underlies that accession number, regardless of whether the submitter actually knows the identity represented by the accession number. EPA's assumption is that if you know the accession number, you also know the CAS number. I don't know why EPA views that. They publish the confidential portion of the inventory with the tens of thousands of accession numbers. Why EPA would assume that if you know the accession number, you know the CAS number, I don't know. But that was their assumption in the rule. That is the regulation, and that is what EPA is doing. If you are supplying someone, and if you are supplying a CBI substance to a customer, and that customer is going to report with an accession number, you need to ensure that your customer is maintaining that CBI claim in their submission. Otherwise, their lack of a CBI checkbox will mean you lose your CBI protection. That's the way it's working right now. As inexplicable, I can't explain it. That's the way it's working. I think that's my last slide, and we're on to questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Rich and Dave. That was terrific. You covered an awful lot of real estate in a very compressed period of time. So hats off. And I'm going to welcome Stephanie Griffin to this component of the webinar, as Stephanie and Dave will be responding to questions jointly. So the first question, unsurprisingly, relates to TSCA 8A7 PFAS reporting. And the question is, could someone please clarify if the packaging that imported goods are shipped in is in or out of scope of PFAS reporting? Rich, do you want to start off with that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. The short answer is yes. That packaging is probably imported as an article, but articles are not exempt from 8A7 reporting. There is a question about at what point, if the product that's imported is a non-TSCA product, there is some demarcation between the external packaging that is subject to 8A7 and the product, the non-TSCA product that is excluded from 8A7 reporting. That would be a very fact-specific review, but basically packaging is 8A7 reportable.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie or Dave, you want to respond, if at all?
Yeah, one other thing is to underscore the reporting standard here, because this has come up. We've seen from folks who maybe assume that they need to now test their packaging materials for whatever products they've imported. And of course, that's not the case, as Dave relayed. This is based on existing information or information reasonably ascertainable to you. So you don't need to now go and test all of your previous packaging materials with your imports.
Excellent. All right, I'll move on to the next question. The person who presented this question writes, they have a complaint system for customers to write in about issues with products. And the question is, can that be counted as a retaining system for customers reporting new hazards under TSCA Section 8?
So I will start, and I do want to. I'm not sure if the person who asked the question is here and able to provide a little more detail. When I read this, I wasn't sure what specifically they were referring to, but I'm going to respond to this, assuming that this is referring to Section 8C.
Mm-hmm.
So those are those significant adverse health or environmental reactions. So if that's the case, if we're talking about 8C requirements. I'm not able to say right now, just based off of that level of knowledge, if an individual company's complaint system from customers alone, meets those requirements. Just as a reminder, under 8C, companies, manufacturers and processors need to have, they need to retain any records that they receive related to those allegations. Those records do need to be kept, at some central location or the company's headquarters. And these records do include things that may be submitted from those individual customers. So whether that alone suffices, or may be supplemented by additional mechanisms and records, you'll need to determine what makes the most sense or what works for your company to meet those requirements.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And if the person who raised that question wishes to embellish it, just send me or Rich an email and we'll be happy to expand upon a response. But thank you, Stephanie. Okay, next question. If we reported in 2020, but have nothing to report in 2024, do we need to make a submission to EPA stating that we have nothing to report? And where is the bulk upload Excel file? I guess that's
So I can start this, and if Dave has anything to add, please go ahead. So for CDR, if you don't have anything to report, and I believe this is actually true for all of our 8A rules, there is no requirement to submit anything to EPA. If you do wish to voluntarily submit that you don't need to report, I believe the mechanism available to you would be going through CDX, the TSCA communications module. You would not use eCDR web if you're not reporting. Regarding the bulk upload, that should actually be available now. That's actually both in the reporting tool in CDX, as well as on the new CDR Guide Me website that Dave shared. So you'll find those in the additional materials.
Okay, great. Rich, anything to add?
No, just you may drop off the CDR, but again, be aware EPA is going to see you reported in 2020 and now you're not reporting in 2024, and may call and say, hey, you didn't report in 2024. So be sure you're confident of your non-reporting.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. Given the breadth of materials considered PFAS as currently defined, will EPA recognize distinctions within the category based on factors including potential for environmental migration and accumulation, annual production quantities, and small business? I know when this question came in, it was hard to determine whether that recognition was going to be in terms of the weight of the information submitted under 8A7 or in some other context. But Rich, Dave, Stephanie, if you want to take a shot at it.
Yeah, so let's differentiate how EPA is going to use the data from the reporting obligation, right? Which is,
Right.
today we're talking about the reporting obligation. EPA, once they receive the data and the data that they're gathering under TSCA Section 4, they'll start to review all of that information in terms of the hazards and exposures and the risks. That is a separate exercise that's going to happen in the future.
Stephanie, anything to add?
Strictly speaking on the 8A7, any reportable PFAS should be reported. I mean, we're not making distinctions here based off of some of the factors that were listed, and obviously there's no production volume based threshold. So, yeah.
No exemptions.
Those considerations might be made on the interpretive side, but not on the reporting scope side.
Right.
So.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The next person would like to hear some more about how the rules apply to substances in articles. And again, I don't know if that's unique to 8A7 or reporting obligations writ large. So Rich, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, so it depends on the rule. Articles are exempt from CDR, but 8A7 articles, substances in articles are not exempt. And for the 8D rule as proposed, testing on substances that are in articles would not be exempt. So it depends on the specific rulemaking. You do need to pay attention. But CDR, the article exemption, is still in place.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'll push on. Will EPA provide guidance, Stephanie, on how and when submitters must provide use and exposure information in the OECD harmonized templates, OHTS 301 to 306?
So some of my colleagues are actually working on providing that level of guidance now. I don't have a specific date for when to expect that, but I know that it should be, we're planning for late summer, early fall for when that can be available.
Okay, great. Next question, will we need to reach out to suppliers who were active during that period, some of whom may no longer be active suppliers for us today, if we find that a part we use today contains PFAS?
You're talking about retrospective reporting under 8A7, back to 2011.
That would appear to be implicit in the question, Rich.
Yep.
So I can start off. The answer to that is going to be maybe. As Dave mentioned, the known or reasonably ascertainable standard does apply. How that looks for different companies is going to be different, and EPA recognizes that there are many factors that determine the scope of information that is under that category, under that standard for different companies, depending on their size, the industry they're in, the relationship with their suppliers, and so on.
Yeah, I would just add that if you are importing a PTFE gasket, and you got that PTFE gasket from a different reporter or a different supplier back in 2011, 2012, it's pretty likely that it was still a PFAS. You were buying PTFE gaskets from a different supplier. So that would be a case where it would be reasonable to assume that the PFAS was present back in the past. But if you find out that there's a PFAS in a different product, that it doesn't necessarily provide an inherent function, and it might not have been present in the past in something that you procured in 2011 or 2012, then that might be a case where you don't report that for that product. But it's fact specific, as Stephanie mentioned. You got to look at the specifics.
Next question, how should a company substantiate CBI for an accession number that we don't know the chemical identity? Do we need to work with the supplier, or can the substantiation simply be that we don't know the chemical identity?
Again, if this is, I'm not sure what rule they're talking about. So if this is CDR, if you don't know the chemical identity, you are required to initiate a joint submission.
Oh, but they know the accession number.
They know the accession, but not the chemical identity.
They don't know the CAS number, but they know the accession number.
Okay. In those cases, I believe that you would still initiate a joint submission. Unless they are referring to the PFAS 8A7 rule, in which case there may be cases where a joint submission is not required.
Yeah, and if the questioner chooses to embellish this, and we can dig a little further, we will do so.
And it may be a question that the CBI group needs to
Yeah,
answer.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I
Um,
was going to recommend. They should reach out if you have a specific question, and we can look to try to make this guidance a little more self-evident if it's not easily found online. But I think we should
Mhm.
probably refrain from giving an answer since we're not
Okay.
the experts on CBI here.
Fair enough, Dave. And I'm going to ask one more question and then we're going to have to close because this is probably easy. Does the primary AO have to be based in the US?
No, they can be based outside of the US, but the site must be in the US.
All
Yeah,
right,
they need to have a US address they're tied to.
exactly.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're at 12 o'clock high here in the East Coast, so I'm going to have to close. I'm really want to give a very, very warm thanks to Dave and Stephanie. You guys are terrific, terrific content. And Stephanie, thank you so much for assisting on the Q&A component. We're very grateful for EPA's participation. Rich, as always, we value your participation and expertise, and just thank you all for a wonderful, wonderful webinar. Again, the recording, the materials, the resources, and the bios will all be sent to registrants. So thank you very much, and we appreciate you joining our webinar today. Bye.